Hi everyone, welcome back to the second part of the week. This lecture, we're going to kind of build on what we learned in the last lecture. In the last lecture, we kind of went through the history of how juveniles were treated throughout history, throughout time, different assumptions based on what they perceived the juvenile to be and how it affected their treatment. So now we're going to move on and really break that down into what we call models of how juveniles should be treated in the juvenile system. So we're going to take all that history and boil it down to 5 specific models. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to start looking at those specific models and what those models are. So to get us thinking about that, I just have this question. Which is more important in handling juveniles? Is it better to think about the best way to rehabilitate the juvenile and fix them, like what's in their best interest? Or when we're treating juveniles, is it best to protect society from delinquent juveniles? Should we be more concerned about society and what these delinquent juveniles are doing to society? So how you view that answer may affect which model you think works best for juvenile justice. Okay, now that idea has changed over time. It's not been a static thing. It's not like there's one right answer. During different times when we talked about different assumptions that people made and different thoughts that people had about juveniles, it really affected how we think we should treat juveniles in the juvenile justice system. So you can see this changing idea throughout these 5 models that we're going to talk about. So these are the 5 models. So the Puritan model, the refuge model, the traditional model, the due process model, and the punitive model. So we're going to walk through each of those. Now, as we walk through those models, you'll see I posted this online, your models of juvenile justice. You might want to print this worksheet out if you have a printer at home, or even just call it up and type into it maybe. So you can have this all together in sort of one chart. So I did post this if you want to take your notes on this chart so you can really see the differences between the different models. And then you may want to use this chart on your homework for the chapter assignment and also on the first exam. It may be helpful. So I did post that so that you have that available to you. So let's start out with the Puritan model. So the Puritan model is one of the very first, obviously, histories that we have of how juveniles were treated in the juvenile system. There was no juvenile system, just how juveniles were treated. And it was really based on the idea of England's criminal justice system, which was really the adult system. Okay, so we really didn't treat them different from adults. They were kind of like all lumped together as adults. So the main philosophy of the Puritan model were that children were inherently evil. So we talked about that in the last class. Are you inherently evil, or do you become evil based on other things? The Puritan model believed that children were inherently evil, sinful, right? And they needed to pray. So in order to control these sinful children, we needed to have really strict, tight control. And we believed that that tight control should come solely from the father. The father was the absolute authority over the children and all family matters. So the father ultimately had control over all juveniles. Now, this idea was based on certain assumptions. There was the assumption that they were inherently evil. There was the assumption that they are property and the parents could do what they thought best for that family to the child since they were their property. They believe that the outside controls like society, church, things like that should never step in. It should be the father's ultimate decision unless it's an extreme situation where the parents completely failed to do anything. Other than that, there should not be external control. It should be just based on what the father decides. And they believed in very harsh consequences for children's misbehavior. Okay, so they believed in harsh punishments. They didn't believe in reform or fixing them. They wanted just to punish them if they weren't following what the father said. Now, during this time period, these would have been like the major legal changes or legal things that existed during this time period. in Massachusetts, passed the Massachusetts Stubborn Child Law, which basically took this common law English Puritan strictness, the father has control, and turned it into law in this country. It was the first major law. So it really sort of codified or put into law this Puritan model, that the parents have ultimate control over disobedient children, and that the court will only step in if they are completely, the parents are unable to take that control. And they also use this idea that children aged older than 7 really should be treated like adults. So harsh punishments, bad things, just for even rebelliousness, disobedience, things like that. So they really adopted this harsh treatment of juveniles. So if we look at the ultimate treatment, misbehaving children were controlled by family punishment, external punishments only if necessary, and very, very harsh punishments. And they even endorsed the death penalty if children didn't believe or just kept disobeying their parents. Like, it wasn't, if you beat them to death, if you beat your child to death because they weren't obeying, that was okay. It was okay to do those things because the parent had ultimate control. So that's the first model. Eventually, we sort of started shifting into what we call the refuge model. The refuge model still believed that the parents had control and should have a lot of say in the situation, but there was a little bit of shift away from how evil they were, and we started to see children as in need of some protection and reform. So instead of these harsh, terrible punishments, we started to move a little more towards protecting and taking care of children. So the main philosophy during the refuge model was that poverty was really a crime, and that we could eliminate that crime with juveniles by removing children from offending environments. So if the parents aren't providing what's necessary, the state has some duty to protect that child, remove them from that environment, and help reform them away from the unacceptable behavior. So a little less of parent actual control or ultimate control, and a little more towards the state stepping in, especially to remove them from very poor or unacceptable conditions. So what were the assumptions that this model was based on? That we do need to provide some protection for children, because we don't necessarily want to send them to jails or prisons, so we need some protection from them. There was a basic assumption that this only really applied to lower class families, that there was an idea that poverty drove this, and so if we removed them from poverty, we could fix them. The state should step in to protect against poverty. There was also the idea that big cities and urbanization and poverty and immigration also contribute to this. So there was a lot of ideas that we needed to move more towards removing them from these bad situations. And then again, we talked about this in the last class, it moved a lot towards training and apprentice and hard work, and we can save them through these science sort of things. So what legal changes did you see? You saw a shift towards the idea that the public has a responsibility to take care of and treat and help reform children. The problem is we didn't really have a legal framework to do that. In the past, the system was really for adults, and then the parents took control in the homes. So we didn't really have a lot of legal foundation to do these things, but we started to inch towards it. And then since we didn't have a separate court system, what they did is they were just taking the children and putting them into these like reformatories, houses of refuge, foster homes. And then again, we started to create these status offenses so that we could take control of children that weren't following the rules. So how were children ultimately treated in this area? We removed them from the offending house and placed them in reformatories and houses of refuge. We believed that we needed public education to Americanize foreign or low-class children, and so they would fit a certain model, again, saving the children. The problem is we often lumped all children together, even though there were different classifications, delinquent, dependent, neglected. We just kind of lumped them all together. They still did believe in harsh punishments in the refuge model, like in the reformatories, they did use harsh punishments, whipping, solitary confinement. So they still were really, really tough places to be. Maybe not the death penalty, because we did want the state to have some reform on children, but they did use harsh punishments. And then you saw the creation of these like orphanages and asylums where they would put people to Americanize and improve these children's conditions. We eventually started to move into the idea that we really need a complete legal system that's different from the adult system. So the refuge system, we created places to put juveniles. The traditional model, we started moving towards a more formal legal system, that we were going to legally treat juveniles and adults completely different. Okay, now the philosophy was that adolescence is a very special time. Children are still developing. Their brain isn't quite working the same way as adults is working, so that we need a legal framework to care for these juveniles. And so you started to move more towards parens patriae, and we started to create that legal framework for the government to become more involved. Now, we started to move away from the idea that children were property. We really did recognize them as independent, or not independent, but individual adolescents. We recognized that they were different from adults socially, mentally, physically, morally, their brains. We started to understand that they just weren't the same level as adults. They couldn't form mens rea to commit crimes. So we needed to have this framework to take care of them. We also still really believed that delinquency was really created by the social environment, the neighborhood, families, things like that. So if we could remove them with parens patriae and the state could step in, we might be able to move them from those offending environments and help them, reform them. We also believed that middle-class misbehavior was more acceptably controlled by parents, but if you were lower class, then you needed the public to step in. So it also became kind of a class issue. Now, when the court system was first created, we had the adult system and the juvenile system. The idea was that we do treat juveniles different because they're different, but they should not have the same rights as adults. Since we're going to treat them and protect them, we're not going to give them the same due process rights, right to attorney, right to jury, right to trial, because they don't need it. It could actually hinder things. So we need a system where the state decides what's proper and what's necessary, and we're not going to give children the same due process rights that adults have. That they're only entitled to shelter, protection, guardianship for us to watch out. And we, the state, parens patriae, can make that decision. And you don't need any extra due process rights. So this was the big change in the juvenile system. This is when that framework was ultimately created. So the Illinois Juvenile Court Act was the first time an actual separate legal system was created to deal with children. So now we have the adult system and we have the juvenile system. And basically we set the ages under 16, so 15 and younger. Again, no due process rights. We didn't think that was necessary. The state knew what was best, and their standard is the best interest of the child. So they don't need due process because the court's always going to look out for their best interest. But the state will step in and act as parents, especially if the parents cannot do it. The other thing was that we give broad discretion to the juvenile system. We believe they're going to always look out what's best for the juvenile. So we'll let them make all the decisions. We aren't going to have all these extra things controlling the decision. We're going to let the courts have discretion to do this. But we're going to have different terminology so that we don't have stigma to juveniles. We're also going to keep the records all sealed. Everything's going to be confidential because we don't want to create stigma. We're going to reform them, and what's in their best interest is to reform them, return them back to society without the stigma of being a criminal. So parens patriae still played a significant role. We still had institutionalization of juveniles because the state, if they believed that was the best way to, best interest for the child, to institutionalize them away from parents, we still were going to do that. So we had orphanages and other organizations. But instead of the use of strict, harsh punishments, we're going to sort of gently lead them back. The state is going to wrap their arms around them and protect them and gently move them back into conformity without using harsh punishments. Some people started to see this as the idea that, okay, you may treat them differently, but that doesn't mean that they're being treated well. And so there was a big reform movement that juveniles were entitled to the same constitutional protections that adults were. So in the prior traditional system, we didn't worry about all those constitutional rights, but there was a big push that juveniles were entitled to those same constitutional rights. It's in the best interest of the child to assure that their constitutional rights are protected. So the idea was that parens patriae wasn't really deterring delinquency, and that by denying their constitutional rights, it could actually be inhumane. It could lead to more inhumane treatment. Maybe they're not using their best discretion to take care of these children. We need to certify that their constitutional rights are being protected and they are being treated humanely. Okay, so you need to provide these due process rights. Now, this was based on the idea that due process. Now, remember, this was the era of civil rights movement and stuff where there was a big push for constitutional protections. So the idea was that due process is really important for children also, and that children are constitutionally entitled to due process protections, and that we can't deny them their due process constitutional rights. If we need to treat them well, just because it's a separate system doesn't mean it's a good system. So we need to assure their constitutional rights. We also know that children are persons with rights that need to be and protections more than just the right to be saved. So before we thought you have food, shelter, guardianship. Well, no, now we really feel the court should step in and should also be protecting those constitutional rights. So children are entitled to more than just food, shelter, guardianship. They are entitled to their constitutional rights. So we still maintain the best interest of the child, and the best interest of the child is to assure that their due process rights are guaranteed. This was really reaffirmed in the decision in Regault, which we'll talk a lot about later in the class. It was the premier case that assured that juveniles were given certain constitutional rights. One of the side effects of it is the juvenile system has become much more rigid and formal, and it's starting to move much more to resemble the adult court. It's much more adversarial when you have all these protections. And that's one of the criticisms of this due process model. It's just turned the juvenile system into the adult system. So how were children treated? They did get more constitutional protections. There was a push for less institutionalization, so deinstitutionalization, decriminalization, a push to move away from those status offenses, more treatment for children. But we still were sort of lumping all children together in the system. But we were recognizing that children did have rights, and they even have rights against their own parents. So you saw a push for allowing children to seek emancipation or separation from their parents if their parents were not providing what they needed. After that, we sort of as a society got really strict on crime. We were really sick of crime that was occurring, and we started to say what we were doing wasn't working. If people commit crime, they deserve what they get. And that theory sort of moved on to juveniles too. So we're just kind of starting, I think, to leave this model, but this model is still pretty prevalent in our society. The juveniles may be different, but they still are rational. They still have a brain. They still know right from wrong. And therefore, we need to hold them accountable, like for their criminal behavior. Now, there's also was a push that we're not going to treat them soft or sweet or nice anymore. We're going to stop worrying what's their best interest. They're committing crimes against society. They're hurting people in society. We need to worry about society. We need to not worry what's in their best interest anymore. So the philosophy was all persons, even juveniles, should be held accountable and responsible for their actions. And we want to get tough on crime, including juvenile crime. So you're moving more away from treating them nicely and much more to tough on crime, almost reverting back to the original model. Not the parents are not making this decision, the father anymore, but the states are making these harsh punishments. So the idea, we still knew that they weren't intellectually, socially, or morally developed, but we don't care anymore. they're developed enough to know right from wrong, so they deserve the punishments that they get. They commit crime. They make rational decisions to commit crime, so they need to suffer the consequences. We did still believe in Parens patriae, but instead of worrying about what's in the best interest of that child, we need to focus on what's best for society. We don't want to treat them soft anymore. They have consequences, so we don't want their records to be private anymore. So we used to seal all juvenile records so that the stigma didn't follow them. We're moving away from that and allowing those records, and we need them to be accountable in order to protect society. So what was some of the legal changes? Much harsher legislation for getting tough on juveniles. We talked about waiving juveniles from juvenile court to adult court. We saw a lot more juveniles being waived to adult court for even more minor offenses. We saw a shift away from rehabilitation and much more focus on punishment and justice for children. So we're not going to treat you as reforming anymore. We're just going to punish you for what you did. And again, we're going to focus on the best interest of society. So ultimately, juveniles' crime is no less serious, so they're going to receive the same serious punishments that adults receive. Okay. So we have this constant shift between these philosophies. Should our system be based on the best interest of the child, or should our system be based on what's the best interest of society? And that has shifted in the different models. And so you have to kind of think about it. There's not really, I guess, a right or wrong answer. I mean, you may feel that one is right over the other, but it has been a shifting thing. And it's just kind of push and pull that exists within our legal system. So what I'm going to do, if you're online, I'm going to post a list of statements of things that describe one of the models. So if you want to, you can look at that and see if you can identify which model is being described with the statement. And then you can check the key to see if you got it right. Okay. It's just a learning check just to see if you know your understanding. And then once you feel comfortable with the models, then you have chapter 1 assignment. You have a little scenario and you have to talk about the different models and which model would work best with this juvenile. Okay, so that is the end of this week's lecture. So we are done with chapter 1 in the book. And so hopefully you got all the concepts. If you need any, oh, I forgot to tell you the word. I'm so glad I remembered. The word is punitive model. So the last model that we just talked about, the punitive model, that is your key word for this week. So make sure you stop the video, write the word punitive model down, send it to me in an email to get your marked attendance for this lecture. So once you feel comfortable, work on your homework. If you have any questions, reach out and I will definitely be here to help you. And I will see you next week as we keep moving through the materials. Bye.